and if it looks like it's on this line, then I'm going to say, yeah, it's a shoe. And so I'm generalizing to new stuff, right? I've never seen this before, but that's my answer. And of course, that's going to work sometimes, and sometimes it's not going to work. So here's an example of a shoe that's actually just slightly on the wrong side of the line. So, but it's much better to do that than it is to say, oh, I only know about the exact things that I actually happen to have seen, and if you show me anything that's even slightly different from it, then I'm just like, I don't know, I've never seen that before. Okay, so that would be an example of lack of generalization. So going back to the example of technology that we interact with, have any of you ever used this app, like Shazam, or there's another one called kind of SoundHound that's kind of similar? Okay, so tell me, what does Shazam do?
Records a sample of a song and then it tries to tell you the information about it.
So like you're in a supermarket or something and you hear some song playing and you're like, oh, what song is that? And you kind of hold up your phone to the speaker, and actually does kind of quite a good job of actually saying, this is, and it'll give you the precise track, the precise recording. It works quite well. I don't know if you've ever played with it. There's a couple of apps a bit like that. Okay, so suppose you you're in the store and they're playing, I don't know, they're playing Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Heart Club Band, and you recognize it, and it takes you to the Beatles list on iTunes. Okay, and then you're walking along the street as you come out of the store, and there's some guys with guitars, and they're playing their version of it. Okay, and you hold up Shazam to that. What will it do?
So I think Shazam actually can tell, like you can hum a song to Shazam.
Oh yeah, I think they're getting better actually.
But I guess you're trying to get me to say that it would recognize it.
Well, that's actually a very, very interesting question. Okay, so suppose you do hum a tune. So I don't know if someone we could try this. Suppose you do hum or something and it can recognize it. It's actually done something very, very difficult in doing that. Okay? So to recognize the particular recording, even if it's played over noisy supermarket speakers, is basically just doing a very direct match. They call it like the kind of audio fingerprint of the song, and it's literally just saying there's a particular sequence, a particular time order, and I'm going to go look for that exact time order plus some corruption by noise of people coughing in the background or something like that. Okay, and that's not actually that easy, but it's much, much, much easier than hearing some people playing essentially the same melody, but they might have different instruments. They might be singing it kind of faster or slower, different voices. They might be playing it, I don't know, just on brass quintet or something. To recognize that that's the same song is much, much harder, and maybe some of the apps can actually do it now, because it's going away from this surface level of what's the actual kind of audio waveform that I'm sort of expecting it to be, to capturing something much deeper. To what's the actual melody? They might be playing a different key. Okay. So that's huge generalization. Okay, if you can actually, which we do all the time. You're walking along the street and you hear some musician playing some song that you're like, oh yeah, they're playing that song that you don't feel yourself kind of puzzling. I mean, if they're playing it reasonably well, you don't feel yourself going through some very, very complicated process of extracting the musical essence of the song, mapping that into a different instrument, played at a different speed, by different singers, and reproducing it and seeing, and someone saying, oh yeah, that's the same song. You're just like, oh, I like that song. Let's give them a buzz. So there's something very difficult and interesting going on there that it's kind of hard for classifiers to do, and yet somehow our brain does this incredibly well. So here's an example of generalization. So you just go into Google search and say, show me some pictures. So this is the top pictures that come up when you type in for Johnston. Okay? I think that we can all pretty much, without any difficulty whatsoever, tell that these are all pictures of the same guy. Now, algorithms are getting kind of good these days, but which of these pictures would be particularly difficult for an algorithm to figure out is a picture is the same as everyone else. Sorry, this is maybe too low on the screen. I should raise it up a bit. But let me raise this up a bit so it's easier to see. Okay, so any thoughts? Which of these would be? I mean, for us, they're all kind of easy. I mean, I think. But for which of these would be particularly difficult for a classifier to? Someone who hasn't said something yet, preferably. But I'm grateful for people who have said something. This is not, by the way, this is not a trick question. Okay, anybody who, it doesn't matter if you said something.
When his face is obscured with his hand.
There you go, excellent, okay. And so not only is his face obscured, but he's pulling a funny face, right? I mean, he's a comedian, so he pulls funny faces, okay? It's very easy for us to tell that, you know, this kind of simple, plain, frontal, you know, neutral expression view here is the same as this guy, where he's, you know, covering half his face with his mouth. He's got something kind of weird going on with his cheeks and his eyebrows, okay? And we're like, oh yeah, you know, that's just like John Stewart pulling a funny face, okay? Whatever is happening in our heads, you know, whether it's a classifier algorithm, whatever it is, there's something, you know, there's something very, it's actually really quite difficult. This is actually a very difficult task for a computer to do, to figure out this is the same person. Oh, it's at a slightly different angle. And then there's one other which is kind of a little harder as well.
The black and white version.
Exactly. And there's actually two aspects of that make it difficult, right? So one is, actually there's kind of three aspects of it that make it difficult. But at least, so one is that, you know, obviously it's black and white, so there's all kinds of helpful cues. Like the guy has kind of more or less the same skin tone in most of these, except, you know, a little bit washed out maybe this. Okay, so you've got a reduced representation, right? Or an entire dimension has gotten any color. And plus, you know, it looks like it's from his high school yearbook. He's like, you know, 18 years old or something. So there's a sense in which you can just immediately say, oh, this is the older version of him. But if I were to ask you to, remember you said like in words it's kind of hard to describe, you know, give me a list of rules for recognizing someone's face. Well, it's got two eyes. Oh, hang on a minute, what if I'm seeing them from the side? But then at least you kind of have an idea of what a description might begin to look like. You know, give me a description in words of you know, what it is that allows you to tell that this is a younger version of this person. That's kind of hard to do. Very hard to do. I mean, you know, you could say, well, his hair's a little bit gray or something, but, you know, I could show you somebody else with gray hair and you wouldn't say that's an older version of John Stewart. You'd say it's an older version of someone else. Okay? So there's some kind of commonality here, which is kind of hard to capture. But actually, that's probably a little bit easier for a classifier actually than the one where he's kind of hiding his face and pulling a funny expression. But we can do this. We can do this without breaking a sweat, without even noticing that this is a difficult problem. And it's actually a true statement that people didn't really understand that this was a difficult problem until they tried to build artificial systems that could do it. And then after about a couple of decades, this is not an exaggeration, after a couple of decades of failing to do what they actually thought would be an easy problem, they were like, oh, hang on a minute, this is actually kind of a difficult problem. So there's really two senses, at least two senses in which in this class we're going to be looking at classifiers in the brain. So one is in the sense that you can take brain images and try and recognize patterns in them, and that can let you ask interesting questions. So that's one. But another is that, you know, we're trying to, you know, what we don't really care about, you know, just taking some numbers and crunching them, even if, you know, I mean, that can be an interesting and fun exercise. But what we really care about is trying to understand how this piece of meat between our ears is able to achieve these astounding things, such as, you know, figure out that this is all pictures of the same person. And you know, there's a lot of theories out there right now, but nobody really knows the answer to that. And you can tell that nobody knows the answer to that, because if they did, they would be able to build that they would say, oh, here's the answer, and then build that into a system, and then they would make a system that, in fact, would be just as good as we are at doing this kind of recognition, and there does exist no such system. As you encounter every day when you call up some telephone answering service and you're trying to ask for opening hours at the bank, and it tells you what your current balance is or something like that, right? So often these systems make mistakes that we would never make, and that's because nobody understands. People have ideas, but nobody understands why we are so good at it. So there's kind of these two senses that we're trying to understand a little bit here. So the other thing I was going to say is, but I don't think you can see this, is there's actually a third thing that makes this one kind of extra difficult, is none of the other pictures has a tag attached to them. This one actually has a name. You probably can't read this because this one actually has a name on it. So this is labeled data. For those of you who work with the classifier, and we're going to be talking about this too. So labeled data is where I say this thing here, it's along this position in the height and weight space, and it's a student. The label is saying, and it's a student. So okay, that's very helpful. Thank you very much. And unlabeled data would be, if I made these all the same color and the same shape, and I said, here's a bunch of stuff. I'm not even going to tell you that there's two classes in there. Just this stuff that you can see what you can find in this stuff. So that's unlabeled data. You can see that's a more difficult problem. This is actually labeled data, but it has the wrong label. Okay, you probably can't see this, but it says like Jonathan Leibovitz, I think, because John Stewart is not his real name. So that this would an algorithm that's actually smart would actually go and look for labels, because a lot of images on the web are kind of tagged and stuff, and there's good people working this. And if you can find the labels, you're in pretty good shape. Except sometimes the labels are wrong. And in fact, you'll find this actually sometimes if you go to like Google image search and say. Type in, I don't know, the word brain or something, a bunch of pictures will come up, and most of them are pictures of brains, but some of them will be pictures of something completely random that for whatever reason just had the word, someone typed the word brain next to it, or it'll be like that little cartoon character who's called Picture of Brains. Okay, so sometimes the labels are wrong too. So what we're trying to understand, and this is kind of going to be one of the big themes, is what is the classifier doing, how can we use it, and how do classifiers succeed, how do they fail, when does the brain kind of look like it might be doing something similar? When does the brain succeed? When does it fail? The brain succeeds a lot more, but brain fails in interesting cases too. So, okay, so let's go a little bit more into some of this. We're going to discuss this more over the course of the class, so we're not going to cover everything today. So we kind of mentioned this a little bit last time, that one of the things that is distinctive about trying to look at patterns of activation rather than just particular kind of hotspots of activation is that if you look at distributed patterns, you don't just have to look for like a particular region that becomes active for a particular task. And one of the main drawbacks of just looking for a particular region that's active for a particular task is because it kind of makes you feel like you're finding the part of the brain that is the area responsible for X. So those of you who are at the computer practical last week, and we've been kind of, just for space reasons, restricting that to registered students. And for those of you who are on the newer computers where the viewing program actually worked properly, we were kind of, sorry about that, we were kind of surfing around a little bit, trying to find voxels that actually were responding in a way that looked kind of similar to the pattern that we'd expect from when the blocks of stimuli were going on and off. And what you discovered is that you can actually click around quite a lot, and most of the time the line just looks like a kind of bunch of noisy junk. And then if you kind of just click on just about the right place, just right in the middle of ventral temporal cortex, if you find a couple of voxels where suddenly the time course kind of starts going up and down in a very similar to the time course of the block design, and then we kind of pulled out that time course and we plotted it on top of the block time course, and they kind of line up. But you had to kind of click around quite carefully to find that spot, and in fact we even ended up kind of putting the coordinates on the board and saying, click exactly here, please. So it really did kind of look like there was a hot spot that was, like the kind of the special little tiny area that was really responsible for, in this case, processing objects or responding to objects. And in a certain sense, that's actually kind of true, because it really was more, that little tiny hotspot really did respond better to objects than all the other places you were clicking. But that really wasn't the end of the story. And so, one of the things we talked about a bit is that, in fact, these activations are more distributed. That's why it talks a lot about in these readings we looked at in the Haxby paper. But unfortunately, it's a very common problem. It's very, especially when it kind of gets into the popular press, it's very easy to just say, well, this is the area for X. So if you actually, this is just a little screen grab of what happens if you go into Google and you start typing, part of the brain responsible for, and they actually become progressively less reasonable as they go down. So part of the brain responsible for speech. Well, there is kind of sort of, there are definitely some regions that are very highly specialized for speech, although there's more than one region. Part of the brain responsible for emotion is there's one or two areas that are particularly involved in particular emotions, such as fear, although they're not only involved in fear, but emotion it covers lots of different aspects in neural processing. Love, even more so. So I hope by this point it's starting to become a little bit clearer why it would not really be reasonable to expect that there's a part of the brain responsible for love, right? Because love is kind of complicated. Okay? So it involves a lot of different things. Okay, it's got cognitive stuff, it's got emotional stuff, it's got social stuff. Okay, so that there is not just going to be one little part of the brain. But if you go to Google and you type in part of the brain responsible for love, you'll get plenty of hits of people say, here's a part of the brain responsible for love. And that's kind of unfortunate. And then part of the brain responsible for decision making, again, there's definitely some areas that are very implicated in decision making, but A, those areas do lots of other things too, such as some frontal areas, and B, decision making involves a lot of different things as well. So, and there's just very recently this book came out, Brainwash, the Seductive Appeal of Mindless Neuroscience. It basically, says, don't do this, essentially. And that's obviously an oversimplification. So there's this idea of modules. So what does it mean for something to be modular? So can anyone give me an example of, this isn't necessarily a brain question. Can anyone give me an example of something that's modular? Yeah?
Lego.
Yeah, perfect. That is a fantastic example. Lego, okay? Lego is a very beautiful example of something that's modular, okay? Because you've got these bricks, and each brick is kind of its own thing, and you can put them together, and you can take them apart again, and you can recombine them, okay? So each brick is like a little module, okay? And so a module basically means like these kind of separate things that each kind of does its own bit, and you can kind of combine them again in a different way. That's a very nice example. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I thought it was okay. So some stuff in the body kind of looks modular. Okay, so the classic example, organs. Okay, so I got a liver which detoxes blood. I got kidneys that also clean the blood. I got a heart that pumps it around. So these things, they're separate enough from each other that if you're unlucky, then you can actually have one taken out and a new one put in, and that kind of works. Okay, so that's a very definition of something being modular, that they're kind of swap-outable. But not everything in the body is like that. So examples of more distributed things are, for example, the circulatory system, which is kind of everywhere. Although it does have walls, right? In a sense, the very very thin walls once they get to the lower capillaries. Or the immune system, which is also kind of everywhere, which I suppose doesn't really have walls. So one of the questions that actually people have been debating in neuroscience and in brain imaging in particular, and they're still debating, and will be, I'm sure, for a long time, is the brain modular? And at this point, everybody always cites this is a book, but this is actually a philosopher of mind called Jerry Fodor, maybe you can see this down there, who wrote a book called The Modularity of Mind, that actually suggests this idea. And it's kind of, I think there's a law that if you talk about modular, you have to cite Fodor's Modularity of Mind, which is, I feel very sorry for Fodor because he wrote this entire book, which is actually full of interesting things, but it only gets cited for its title essentially, which is this idea that the mind is made of different modules. And And there's actually a little bit more to, so the idea that the brain may be modular does not necessarily mean that it has kind of, physically distinct things in it, like, there's a liver here and a kidney here and a heart there. Okay, it might mean, and this is, an aspect of the idea of modularity that's less appreciated, it might mean that they're modular more in the kind of functional sense, that they're, so for instance, you might say, the hardware of a computer and the software of a computer are two different things. But if I say, okay, take your computer that's running now and put the hardware on that side and the software on that side, you can't do that because they're physically, literally, in amongst the same parts as each other. But nonetheless, it's entirely reasonable to draw that as a distinction. You could say functionally there's a really clear distinction between these two different things. If software is a thing, it's sort of a thing. So similarly, the question of modularity doesn't necessarily mean that things are physically separated, but it's very, very hard to actually look for things unless they are physically separated. If I say there's these two, unless you already knew beforehand that there were these things, hardware and software in your computer, you'd have a terribly hard time looking for them just by kind of poking around in your computer. Okay. So similarly with the brain. So we kind of discussed a little bit last time, but I hope I'm not repeating myself. I don't think I used this example last time. So one of the real drawbacks of saying, of this kind of modular view, by the way, everything I'm saying right now is not agreed upon by the field universally. Okay, this is my view, and I do not require that you agree with this. And I'm going to present on the other side as well, but this is, what I and a lot of other people think. But there's not universal agreement on this at all. Okay, so suppose I say, what's the part of the brain responsible for X? Now, it doesn't have to be something silly like what's the part of the brain responsible for love, but it might be something like, what's the part of the brain responsible for, fear or something, right? Which is getting a little bit more reasonable, but maybe not quite. So my favorite metaphor for thinking like this is, suppose I say, where in the United States is the economy? Which at first glance, before you kind of think about it, doesn't seem like a completely ridiculous question. And a pretty reasonable first approximation answer might be to say, there's this street, and there's this area in Lower Manhattan that we found, and it's called Wall Street, and that's where the economy is. And a real indication that that's actually not a terrible, terrible answer is that if someone goes in and lesions Wall Street, okay, which actually kind of is what happened in the financial crisis, right? Like suddenly Wall Street just stopped functioning. Okay. That really messed with the economy. Okay? So it's not just that there's like a local concentration, but you can actually do a kind of functional manipulation. You can do a kind of deactivation experiment, deactivate Wall Street, and bang, the economy's gone. That was a real experiment. So, but well, clearly it's you're getting something, but you're missing a big part of the picture if you say the economy is in Wall Street. So a lot of brain function is kind of like that too. So that leads to this bigger problem of, okay, well, it's kind of, if you ask me to investigate this street in Lower Manhattan called Wall Street, I kind of know what to do, right? I take the subway down and I'm on Wall Street, and I'm like, okay, I can, count the banks. But if you're trying to look at the economy in general, that's much more difficult, right? We can maybe agree that it's actually something that you would need to do if you really want to. If you really want to investigate the economy, you're going to have to look beyond Wall Street. But well, where am I going to look? How am I going to do it? It's time to get more difficult. So a lot of this, a lot of the class what we're going to do is try and look at how we can look at broad patterns of neural activation. Just as how would you look at broad patterns of the economy? And what does that tell us about the way in which things might be represented, in which they might be distributed or overlapping representations, as the Haxby paper, for instance, discussed. And then we're also going to be looking at concrete ways in which we can do that, for instance, using classifier algorithms. So I think we're kind of out of time for today, but we'll talk about this more on Thursday.
Thursday's normal class?
Yeah, Thursday's normal class. We're not going to do it. We're going to have more computer sessions, but Thursday's is normal.
See you on Thursday.
morning.
For you, it's tomorrow.
Yeah, in fact, Ben said you want to
Why is that?
say, you know, you want to talk about
So this would at least be a good interview.
Yeah.
One we've sort of been, I'm just sort of being around.
Friends, it's okay, but with
Oh, yeah.
He's able to grab
Be careful.
No, well, this is a very, very interesting lead. I would like to chat to you. Okay, so yeah, so Friday, 2 o'clock.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like a good
well, we have lab meeting.
Hey, Craig, I haven't, sorry. Oh, wait, this is probably like this Thursday. I don't want you to feel like it also means that you're actually more than tell me, you know, like, you actually kind of already know. So I've been curious to negative feedback also highly welcome. Yeah, corrective purposes. So yeah,
So we usually meet in Eleanor 360. So I can make sure you are.
Oh, okay, good. I'll put that on my calendar for 2 o'clock on Friday.
Yeah.
Okay, and Ben mentioned something about how like you guys are trying to put this into a grant or something.
Oh, yeah, so this is sort of.
That's not due like tomorrow or something.
I think that.
And
Or even if it is not.
Yeah. So I think the idea was he wants to write a grant on this sort of, talking about doing this sort of analysis. And he just wants somebody who knows this kind of stuff to sort of sign off and say, yeah, I'll help these guys if they need
Okay,
it.
and I would be fascinated. I mean, obviously I haven't really worked in neurophysiology, but it essentially is the
I-
very
so
same.
The
problem.
more I read about what this sort of multivariate pattern analysis